Welcome to this episode of Making It in Asheville. On this podcast, we tell stories of Asheville makers, artists, entrepreneurs, and we help our community either grow, learn, and I'll say evolve as businesses, as entrepreneurs ourselves. And so this week we have Nick Moen of Bright Angle on the podcast, and I'm very excited to have you on the podcast, Nick. I remember one of the first things I did in the Asheville I'll put air quotes up, entrepreneur community was go to a Venture Asheville pitch competition, and you spoke there, and I was like, this is a cool business. I loved it because you're making real things, and I live in this audio files. I don't know if those are real things. So Nick Moen of Bright Angle, please tell us a little bit about yourself, and this is a hard question, about yourself and about Bright Angle, the tweet, and then we'll get into your story.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm the founder of the Bright Angle, and Bright Angle is a porcelain design studio located on the south slope of Asheville, North Carolina. Our specialty is designing and creating porcelain tabletop home decor and lighting products. So we've been in business for almost 5 years, and we have a small, tight-knit team that handles everything from the design work to shipping out orders. It's been quite a journey building the business.
I can't wait to get into this because I have so many questions, right? Like porcelain, I didn't even know people made porcelain things in like the United States. I didn't know that you can make porcelain. I mean, I know that they exist, right? Clearly, but I don't know anything about the process. I've been on your website now. I've watched you pitch. The stuff you make is gorgeous and like beautiful and modern, but I'll say seemingly timeless. And I don't know what your design aesthetic is going for, but how did you think porcelain? Like, because Asheville is sort of like I would say a clay. Like you see a lot of potters, but porcelain seems to be a different thing. How did you get started in porcelain?
Well, I worked with it when I was in college. Okay. So I took my first slip casting class, which is the process we use in the studio that utilizes mold systems to reproduce products. And in order to utilize the mold systems, you have to pour liquid clay into the molds. Huh. And I became obsessed with porcelain. When I first moved here, I was actually pinching earthenware. So all of my pottery that I was making in my studio at Odyssey Clay Works in Asheville, down in the River Arts District, was all pinched by hand. Huh. And I eventually realized that as somebody that was aspiring to make a living making pottery, it wasn't the most efficient way to produce things. So I switched to a mold system, and one of the most amazing things about using mold systems is you're really able to tame or harness ceramic materials. Mm-hmm. And one of the hardest materials to tame is porcelain. It's really fussy. It has a memory. It's prone to kind of warping and slumping, and all the sorts of flaws that go along with the ceramics process are really kind of synonymous with porcelain specifically. But backing up, porcelain is an amazing material. It was actually, there were wars fought over it. So Europe didn't even have porcelain until the 1700s. There was this king that wanted to develop porcelain because they were trading with China. They were trading ships full of gold for porcelain, teapots and other vessels, because they couldn't heat water in the clay they were using in Europe. So when the spices and teas started coming over from East Asia, they couldn't heat it up. So you had all these amazing spices in this culture that was drinking tea, and they didn't have anything to drink it out of. So they'd send ships full of gold to China and trade for porcelain. And eventually there was this king. He was a German king at the time, and he met this guy who said he was an alchemist. He could turn metal into gold, and of course that's not not possible, but he ended up locking him in a castle. And he said, all right, turn this metal into gold. And unfortunately, he obviously couldn't. This guy, Franz Bacher, was lying. But what he did do is he developed the first porcelain in Europe. And so that really shifted, kind of the whole culture of drinking hot liquids and containing, and it eliminated some of the necessary trade with China. I mean, actually, the Opium War started because of porcelain in China as well, because the Dutch and the British realized that they could grow opium in India or grow poppy in India, and then they got the Chinese hooked on opium, trading it for porcelain.
Wow.
So this material has like a really amazing history. And after the porcelain was developed in Europe, each of the countries formed their own kind of cultural porcelain epicenter with their own proprietary recipes. So in Denmark, you have Royal Copenhagen. In France, you have Limoges. In Germany, you have Meissen, which was the first one. And so, that eventually came to America, although we don't have kind of the same materials that you're able to get in Europe or China.
I want to quickly pause because that was a absolute thrill ride for me from your personal story of looking for more, I'll say, consistency or volume, the potential to not do every piece maybe by hand is how I heard it, and then how important porcelain is and has been in history. And I found myself thinking, perhaps for the first time in my life, that like maybe drinking hot fluids is a relatively new thing. Like,
yeah,
that had never been a thought that I've thought before. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, like a traditional clay thrown or pinched or whatever pot carrier vessel, if hot water went back into it, it might have melted back again?
Well, it would do something called dunting, which means it's like a thermal shock. So when the hot liquid would hit, some of the first ceramics in Europe there was some salt glazed stuff, there was earthenware like flower pots, and they just couldn't handle the heat, the shock of the hot liquid hitting the clay or
Sure.
the ceramic, and so it would crack, it would pop. That's not to say that there's lots of ceramics now and a lot of ceramic materials that can handle thermal shock, but porcelain is so glassy. It has the fewest impurities in it. So one of the impurities is iron, which is red. And so you look at all the hills and mountains around Asheville and you see these, the sides of the roads, they're all this red clay. So iron is an impurity that kind of ends up becoming part of the sediment or inevitability in clay as it deteriorates through time. The other one's titanium, organic matter, leaves, sticks, whatever it is. And all these things ultimately make the ceramic material less strong, durable, less heat resistant. And so with the porcelain, you fire it really hot. It has a high amount of glass. The way I look at it is it's glass with like a white clay bone structure.
Sure.
The white clay is called kaolin, which is a really incredible material that all clay has in it.
And so from these first moments of saying, or maybe you said you worked with it maybe in college for a bit, but you're pinching, imagine by hand, clay products in River Arts, Asheville, and then you reintroduce porcelain. From that moment until the start of Bright Angle about 5 years ago, how much time was there?
Well, I moved here in 2012.
Okay.
And so I'd say I was pinching for maybe about a year or so. And I still pinch for fun, from time to time in between then. But the other reason why I switched to porcelain immediately is I was trying to figure out how to, have a business and start my career. And, kind of first getting out of school, I didn't learn any business education in school.
Even business majors don't. And I imagine you went to some sort of an art school.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah, I
If
went to
you're,
Alfred University in upstate New York and had a really outstanding education in design and craft, materials, ceramic engineering, 3D modeling.
wow.
And so I kind of got all the pieces to, design and create, but as far as how to actually sell the things, that was a whole different story. And so I realized that I just had to kind of make it up. So I ended up creating these experiences. The first one was called Winter Wears, and I hosted it at this gallery in Minnesota where I grew up. And there was 10 potters that made 10 plates and 10 mugs, and everyone came into the gallery and they ate out of or off of the plates and they drank out of the mugs, and there was live music, and it was just kind of this interactive experience of activating this art that we got to make, and bring the community together. And I think the most beautiful thing of pottery, sure, it's great to look at and it's nice to see pictures online, but there's nothing like holding a handmade mug and
Mm.
feeling the glaze and feeling the handle. And creating that experience was, one, an opportunity to activate the art, and two, was an opportunity to, sell the work. Because when somebody's using it, they become, it's hard not to fall in love with
And
with
there's a memory even stronger than, going into a showroom and maybe touching a piece, eating off of it, and the conversations and the, oh, I went to an art exhibit or opening, or I was invited to that is I love that. The marketer in me gives you a round of applause on on having that be one of your first swings. That sounds great.
Yeah, well, and then that continued. I started organizing these dinners at restaurants with a number of different potters. The first one was in Spruce Pine at Knife and Fork, which is a really amazing restaurant up there. And we did a three-course dinner, and the two potters that were also making tableware for it were making it out of porcelain. And I said, all right, well, if they're making it out of porcelain, I can't pinch earthenware for this. And so I designed some plates and cast. I mean, in order to kind of fill that order, if you will, I had to cast 50 different plates so that everyone could eat off of them at once.
Wow.
And so that was kind of the big shift into porcelain, was realizing the opportunity to work with restaurants and create tableware. And porcelain's the most durable ceramics, and so it made sense to have that material in the kitchens.
I definitely wouldn't have guessed that porcelain was the most durable. For whatever reason, I would have imagined it was perhaps brittle because it's I don't know, stronger. Or does that make sense? Glass? I don't think glass is robust, but I guess maybe it is if you think of it compared to clay.
Well, everyone thinks, when they think porcelain, they think of like fine china,
Right, or like a
So
little doll's face or something that
yeah,
gets chipped.
exactly.
Okay.
Well, it's funny, like those cast dolls are actually made out of the same. They're heated up to the same temperature as terracotta pots.
Wow.
So it's really like white terracotta. And so it's funny, the associations that people have with porcelain, because there's so many kind of different. There's a big spectrum of materials with ceramics, and I think people expect porcelain to be delicate and thin. But realistically, you can cast it as thick as you want, and because it doesn't have these impurities in it, it is really strong.
Wow.
And I think but it's synonymous with figurines and tchotchkes and grandma's china. And actually, grandma's china is really amazing. And I mean, I don't know if that term makes sense, but the china that got passed down that was made in China is really great porcelain. It's really fine, and it's so fine that it's translucent. You can see through it, which was also kind of a catalyst for eventually creating the lighting that we make now.
Beautiful. So you're running events. It sounds like you said Minnesota. Did I say here in Minnesota?
Well, the first dinner was in Minnesota. Or the first Winter Wears, which happened for 5 years, was in Minnesota, and then I think we did a total of like 5 dinners at restaurants over the course of 3 years. One of them was at Bull and Beggar in the River Arts
Oh,
District, and
wow.
there was like 15 different artists involved. Yeah, there was 5 different potters that made tableware. There was glass artists that made the glasses. Tina Council is metal worker in town, made bone marrow spoons. Andrew Massey made candle holders, and
Wow.
it was a really, really cool event. And that was probably the pinnacle or peak of kind of organizing those events that I was involved in, at least.
I mean, I love that. I have what's showing up for me, at least, a whole number of questions about that as a sustainable, or I mean, pre-COVID, post-COVID, it sounds very exciting, and I just wonder how successful was it as a sales engine for you? These seem like great events. Were people buying because of it, or is that part of it? Part of the reason that Bright Angle exists now is because that was a lot of work for a moment, and then the moment either did or didn't do enough.
Yeah, well, we definitely sold work.
Okay.
End of the dinner, we'd hand out like a little kind of catalog or check card where you could, write in how many numbers of each plate or cup that you wanted. And there was a lot of work sold, but putting these on was months of work, organizing, marketing. I mean, it was really exciting collaborating with the chefs, though. Like that at the Bull and Beggar dinner, I worked with Matt Dawes, and I created these platters that held a tiny little bowl for beet sorbet. And it was a beautiful art piece. When the bowls came out, they all were sitting up on a little rock salt and they were floating. Ultimately, as amazing as it was for me to experience and see, it wasn't really like an accessible product. Like nobody's going home and eating beet sorbet every day, right? And so I think, and some of the other artists, Josh Kopis, Kate Adams, Hayden Wilson, there was a lot of other local artists that made tableware that was very practical or part of a current collection they did, and collaborated with Matt on what the course was. And and they certainly sold them or kept them in their inventory. I think for me, I eventually kind of moved away from tableware because I was wary of things breaking in the kitchen. It happened a little bit during the dinners, not too much, but I was like, there's plenty of great tableware made in China. I think they'll let them stick to that. So I eventually really did shift more into kind of a vessel oriented practice.
Awesome. And so to just kind of attempt to date stamp it, to put some chronological order into this, you moved to Asheville, you said 2012?
Yeah, I was on I didn't know what I was going to do after college. And so I packed up Prius in Minnesota and I drove. I was on the road for 3 months picking up hitchhikers.
Wow.
And yeah, it was pretty wild. I actually picked up a potter in Minnesota and ended up driving him all the way to Seattle. He said he was biking across the country and he ended up just getting a ride, which is kind of cheating. But and I ran into him at a ceramics conference a couple of years ago. It was really funny. But I was on the road for a few months and my car broke down. So I had to get it fixed. It was the first time it broken down in 3 months. 8,000 miles. I went all the way down the West Coast across the desert, and my friend Matt Kelleher was teaching at Penland School of Craft, and he needed an assistant. So I ended up staying there for 8 weeks and assisting him. And so that was 2012. And that's kind of, I ended up moving everything down that winter of 2012. So the dinners happened until maybe 2015. And at that point, I built up a collection of molds, a whole library of different forms, and started driving around the country doing craft fairs. So I spent, 3 years doing that with my own work and drove to 48 states in the Prius, put on a lot of miles. I'd strap pins to the top of the car on a roof rack and got pulled over by border control. One time I got pulled over in Arizona at a checkpoint, and they were like, "What do you got in the bag? You got a China shop?" I was like, "Yeah,
sort of.
Actually, yeah, it's full of porcelain." And even Roswell, New Mexico, on that trip, I pulled over to take a picture with this alien sculpture, and I had a vase in the picture. I was big into Instagram back then, and this couple walked by and they're like, "Hey, we're going to a wedding. Can we buy that vase off of you?" And they just gave me cash for the vase on the street, which was I needed gas money, but
so that's also fascinating. So what is the life of a traveling craftsman? Like how did, if you're to summarize those months or that year or that time, what's it like being in the trade circuit?
Yeah, well, first couple of years you apply to shows and get rejected.
Oh,
And then eventually you start, getting into the shows and you book up, a full calendar of shows throughout the year and you structure a production cycle around that. So I'd be at home in the studio for a couple months building up inventory, and then I'd hit the road and try and string a few shows together so I wouldn't have to, keep traveling. But it was, I stayed with a lot of now friends that I didn't know. I
yeah.
rarely got hotel rooms. I was always meeting people. It was really great to connect with the people that were buying the work. And that was the model that I was introduced to, in the 90s and early 2000s. That's what craftspeople did, is they did these craft fairs, but they were making 10 times as much as what was possible when I started to do it in the mid-teens. And I remember one show was in Atlanta. It was an American Craft Council show, which are really good. They're expensive shows, but there's a lot of great collectors. And I was packing up my Prius, and this guy who was a woodworker was next to me, and he'd been doing it for like 20 years. He looks at me, he's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, what are you talking about? I'm just packing up from the show. He's like, "No, why are you doing shows right now? Like, I don't think you understand what it used to be like and what it is now." And he said, "There's got to be a different business model to make this work."
Whoa. So that's what I'm thinking about is, do you have a sense of what made it different, 10 times bigger in the 90s? And then, I keep asking as you talk about these different like stages of the business, because it seems to me that all of them have been a lot of work that is not necessarily even close to scalable. And you've mentioned that porcelain's this thing where I'm going to say you can stamp porcelain or fill porcelain. And so there is this, while it's still some sort of a unit-based business, and it will take time, and you can only work as fast as the production engine allows you to. There is a type of scale in it. And so before we get into bright angles, I'll say first year or early days, do you have a sense of what made the crafts circuit different in the teens versus the 90s?
I think, I think one of the common consensus is there was just an aging collector class, and their houses started to fill up with three-dimensional objects, and so they didn't have room. So they'd still buy 2D art, but the millennials and the younger generations weren't going to these craft fairs. They didn't have the same appreciation, and they were shopping online, following along on social media and finding makers that way. And so, there's a huge disconnect between making these physical. Like nowadays, we're selling photographs online. We're not really selling objects. I'm making 3D things in a 2D world. And I think that was the big shift is the way people change the habits, or the way people change their habits in shopping.
Wow. That sounded succinct and dead on. I think the hammer hit the nail as you summarize that. And so this sage Obi-Wan character shows up in a parking lot, says, "Kid, you're crazy. What are you doing?" And what happens next? Is that you start sitting down and thinking about how do I get people to come to me for business? Do you start doubling down on Instagram? Like, how do you take that advice? Do you take that advice, and how do you put it into action?
Yeah, well, at that point, I'd done a couple big wholesale shows. I did a trade show in New York called the New York Gift Show, New York Now. And then American Craft Council has a couple wholesale shows that I did. And so I started having galleries that were, consistently stocking the work. And so there was kind of this process or production process that was happening in my basement at the time. I was working at Odyssey in the River Arts District, and I was working in the basement of my house in West Asheville. And I hired my first employee to work in my basement with me. And it was like this, there's got to be kind of some move forward here. I was outgrowing the space, so I knew my time was up as a resident at Odyssey, and I had to get a space and a bigger kiln, and then I also realized that I really wanted to build a community and interact with other members of the ceramics and arts community in Asheville. And so we moved into the refinery building on the south slope of Cox Avenue, and moved into an 1,800 square foot space, and ended up building it all from scratch. We built all the tables, shelves. We built the big production kiln from scratch, which in hindsight, I've spent more time kind of tweaking it and fixing it than would have been worth it to buy a new one. But it was really kind of this handmade endeavor, just because that's another reason why, I became a potter. I was 14 and I met this master potter, legendary Warren McKenzie in Minnesota, who really kind of was the godfather of the American craft ceramics movement, or the studio pottery movement. And I went out to his house in rural Minnesota, and he had the coolest lifestyle. He had his studio outside his house, and inside it was just all full of art from all of his friends. It was beautiful. And I just listened to him tell stories of his career sitting on his pottery wheel. And when I left, he gave me these two small tea bowls. And I think just, being gifted those, knowing they were handmade by this guy, and hearing his stories and seeing his lifestyle, I knew that that's what I wanted. And at the time, I didn't realize how many problems existed in ceramics. I mean, every step of the way, there's some massive flaw or issue or kind of fault that can happen with the process, from cracking or chipping or slumping, breaking. You could have bad raw materials. And so building the studio, I really wanted to have as much control over all of those factors as possible. And I think that that's one reason why potters are potters, is they love problem solving. There's so many, you wouldn't become a potter if you didn't like solving problems. And so, so building out the studio with friends, it was a great community. And we ended up kind of collaboratively working together on designs for our first collection that we launched in 2016 on Kickstarter, which I guess that was really the shift from thinking about, traveling around the country and doing shows, or having kind of a consistent collection that was scalable, because we had this mold system where we designed one product. We designed, for example, a mug, and the mug was a specific size. We wanted consistency, and we could take, pictures of one in each glaze, put them on the website, and take orders off of that. And that initial Kickstarter, our goal was 15,000, and we raised 32,000 to kind of kickstart the collection and take pre-orders on,
That's amazing.
On the production.
It was I'm gonna pause us here, because I personally love Kickstarter crowdfunding at large, but Kickstarter, and especially then, now it's perhaps different and even more gamified, and like there are people who are I'll say beyond expert at launching successfully, and that's not a normal person. And I think most people see that and go, oh, I could do something like it. And I don't think that's necessarily always the case. Do you remember, like, how much it seems like, because you already have this history of what I'll call producing events, it seems like you would have taken time and strategically produced a launch on Kickstarter, especially if you exceeded your funding goal by 2 times the target. That's really great. To go over $30,000 on Kickstarter is exceptional. What can you remember from how you launched that campaign? Kind of what stands out from that time?
I didn't sleep much. I guess it was, I mean, because we not only did we build the campaign, but we designed, I think it was like an 18-piece collection in 6 months. And so, we kind of shut down the studio. We were still filling some orders, but we mostly shut down the studio, designed this collection from scratch, designed these new glazes, and then built out the marketing campaign. And
were there people like, who did you launch it two, because I think one of my favorite movies to quote and say like it's a lie is if you build it they will come. Sandlot quote, right? Like just because you have a campaign that you have like done the work on in Kickstarter, if you press launch, no one's going to see that necessarily. And so I'm wondering, had you been growing an email list over all those years, all the people who came to events, all the people who you met at trade shows, or am I, grabbing at straws that don't exist? How did anyone know when you launched?
Yeah, so I mean, it really is that. I think the most important advice in like starting a business, making things, is your biggest supporters are going to be your friends and your family, And so really, like, when I started, it was like, all right, this is my collector base because they know me. And launching the Kickstarter, it was an email list I'd compiled over the years of traveling around the country. It was social media. I think I had, a few thousand followers on Instagram that I built up over the years of making my own work. And then we had a phenomenal videographer come in and do a video, which is really impactful because it really was kind of telling the story of what we believed in creating the collection, why we made the objects, why they looked the way they did, and who we were, so people could really relate to the story when they purchased one of the products.
Love it. And so you launched, I imagine, 30-day campaign, and are you constantly emailing people, or are you just sitting back and watching this thing and seeing if it worked?
Well, no, marketing, at least in my experience, marketing is emailing people dozens of times. It's really, there's so much noise out there, and it's really hard to cut through the noise. But, the more times you get in front of somebody or remind them that you exist, the easier it is to have them, eventually become a customer or a supporter of a project or a business. So it was a lot of emails, a lot of social media, but really was reaching out to anyone I'd known saying, hey, here's this project I'm working with, my employees. We collaborated on this body of work. It's really exciting. It's kind of modern design using these mold systems. And we used one thing that's really unique about it that happened kind of by accident is we were trying to design the perfect like test tile, like a little test tile that you could dip in glaze to test colors and stuff. And I just made this little oval cup. It was kind of like a shot glass. And I designed everything on a 3D modeling computer. After pinching, it became the way to kind of make sure all the dimensions fit. And I exported it to go to the 3D printer where we create the first model or prototype to make the mold of. And when you export it, it turns it into a geometric pattern, like ones and zeros. It turns into polygons. And so it came off the 3D printer and it had all these angles on it. And I was like, okay, so here's kind of an accidental aesthetic that I just stumbled into, but it's something that makes sense because it's all these angles are something you can't hand build with easily, you can't throw easily, and it's something that we can translate and showcase, our ability to use design and technology and combine it with our knowledge of craft and materials. And so the whole collection has these facets, and still to this day, like we really work with the facets, the seams, the geometry of the process that we're able to do that isn't something you can do on the pottery wheel or hand building. And I think at that point too, I'd been making and I'd seen so many round things just because of the tool that was used, the pottery wheel for it. And I was like, why does everything have to be round? Why can't it be oval or octagonal or rectangular? And so it was really exciting to realize that there's this whole world of geometry that these vessels can be, and they don't have to be round. Wow.
Okay. So to read that back, there were two main things that I absolutely love. One is email people a lot. I completely agree because that is, I think most artists, and I'll say that I'm artist adjacent. I'm like I want to be an artist. I want to fit in with artists. I want to be a creator. My creations, I think, are just like not music or light fixtures, and so it's not art. someone would tell me that I'm wrong. It could potentially be. Anyway, so artists I find often have this like concept of marketing as like I don't know, selling out, or marketing as against the truth in the craft of it, of whatever they're pursuing. And I think that that's a shame to see the world that way. And it is one of the things I try and tell people is like, you're being of service when you realize that your audience or your customer or your friends and family live a life that doesn't, that you're not the center of. And so when you ask or show up again and remind them of your work, like the time where they're able to actually see it and sit with it, they're going to say, "Oh, I'm so glad that they emailed again. Let me support. Let me do the thing that they've asked me to do. Let me buy the plate. Let me tell friends about the Kickstarter campaign." And it's actually like the more you show up, and you don't have to be like hard selling, but the more that you show up and remind people that you exist, I think you can consider it being of service to them, because they want to support you. They want to show you fandom or love or whatever the thing is. The other thing is you 3D print and use technology in a pretty, I'll call it traditional field. And I love that as a, I don't know, opportunity. Like I think that I like to think about Venn diagrams. You're like, all right, well, what's an ancient thing or a outdated thing? And how can I infuse technology into that space and create something different? And I love that it's maybe a little bit of I don't want to say mistake, but a pleasant surprise that shows up. And when I think of Bread Angle, I think of, I'll call it harder angles in the products that come to mind first for me, your light fixtures, for example. And the thought that wasn't necessarily intentional out of the gate gives me just like a happy serendipity smile.
No, yeah. I mean, sometimes the mistakes are the things that you should fall into the most. And it wasn't necessarily, it was a mistake, it was my naivety on how these digital programs work. And I think, being able to embrace those opportunities that you wouldn't have come to intentionally sometimes can kind of create really good paths in a creative practice. And I think as far as the marketing goes, I mean, we live in a world where we get excited by other people that are excited. It's voyeurism. And so kind of the people I subscribe to are people that are doing things that, I wished I was doing, or things that are inspiring. And I think, if you have something you're passionate about and excited about, it's not a burden to other people to be sharing that, as long as you do it gracefully.
Love that. What 3D printer did you use? I imagine you still 3D print? Oh, we might be frozen.
Yeah. So
okay.
I think I'm back. Yeah. Okay. The studio, fortunately, and kind of by happenstance, the Bright Angle studio is right next door to the Asheville Makerspace. And so all of a sudden I was connected to these incredible, technicians, engineers, tinkerers, and also this library of tools such as TAS6 3D printer, which we ended up buying our own last year, and a laser cutter and a small CNC mill. And so there were all these prototyping tools that provided an opportunity to be able to explore form without starting in clay, and indicatively ended up kind of creating and defining the aesthetic that is the Bright Angle.
I love it. And so how would you, I guess, that's the Kickstarter was, I'll call it, part of phase one. How many phases would you say you've stepped through over the last 5 years?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I wasn't quite aware of, even though I was, selling a lot of pots on the road and with the initial Kickstarter, is I didn't have a background in business. And so it took me a long time to realize that I was creating, quantifiable products that had financial ramifications to them. I think a lot that happens with a lot of craftspeople is they're like, well, I'm just making this mug and I'm going to give it this arbitrary price. Well, that's kind of how we started it. I had some preliminary spreadsheets, but they weren't robust enough to actually kind of define the whole financial picture. So really it took a few years before now I have a spreadsheet where I can plug in, the exact number of minutes it takes for each step of the process, how much materials it takes. And I'm able to, get a number that tells me how many molds I need, how many fit in a kiln,
Wow.
and ultimately kind of have an exact price of what I need to charge in order to make it, a viable and sustainable product.
How has that happened? So do you have, a business coach? Do you take classes online? Have you just been tinkering in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever for the last 5 years, and it's all of a sudden now there's a thing that is working? Because I love that as a progression. Because I'll suspect, I'm willing to argue that most people who are listening who identify artist are either in need of that evolution or and are aware of it and just don't know how to make that change, or are like fighting the realization that that's probably something that I need to do. I just don't know if I want to yet.
Right. Well, and it takes a certain scale, but it ultimately has to do with cash flow.
Okay.
I think being an entrepreneur and understanding what that meant, took time too. It's like, well, there has to be, enough cash coming in order to pay for marketing or pay for other opportunities. And so that, yeah, balancing that too. I have very robust cash flow projections and financial forecasting that I do as well. But the biggest resource initially was Mountain Bizworks. They were incredible. I mean, they provided a loan in order to build out the studio. They provided numerous different coaches for all different, parts of the business side of things that I was learning. And then I connected with the Elevate program, the Venture Asheville, with the Chamber of Commerce. And then that was another resource that helped me really understand what business was and what it took in order to, create a sustainable and scalable business. So both of those resources were incredibly influential in my growth.
I love that. Here's hoping that 2021 we're officially sponsored by Venture Asheville and or Mountain Bizworks, because they are, I will call them as much of a like foundation in Asheville as anything that I've heard in all of the businesses that we've talked to so far. So it doesn't surprise me that one or both of them have shown up as resources for you. When you think, so two words that have shown up in the conversation that I mentally flagged. One are like team, employees. The other is cash flows, marketing. And so pick your poison. I'd love to hear about either and how they started. So did you have formal like a team or employees at the early days? Were you able to pay people? Because it feels like the cost of a team would be about as big as any of the inputs in making a physical good. It would be as big as the kiln or the clay. And I don't know if those are the right words, but labor cost is always a gigantic line item on a business that has people. And so I'm wondering, did you start there? And then maybe we'll finish with some talks about marketing and cash flows.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had that single employee when I was working in my basement, and actually I'd never managed anybody. I'd never had employees. I really didn't know what I was doing. Fortunately, my father's a contract lawyer, so he kind of helped organize a structure for what that employment relationship looked like, which was really beneficial in creating expectations, which are ever evolving. But yeah, the original team was really tight knit. We were really excited about kind of having built the studio and releasing the collection. One thing, yeah, I mean, marketing comes next. We can talk about that, but that ultimately is always the most challenging thing. You know, they say if you build it, they will come. And I mean, maybe if you wait 20 years, right?
Yeah.
But it really, it takes a lot of energy, effort, and the right people and right minds and strategy in order to market brand products. But yeah, the team is ever evolving. We pretty much have only employed potters. We have had a couple people with other craft backgrounds, but I think people that understand ceramics and the materials have a better grasp on what the job looks like.
Sure.
And it's production work, you know, as far as the production manager and assistants go. They're working with material, doing very labor intensive processes that are repetitive, but you know, can be really therapeutic, just kind of throwing your headphones on and going through a run of the same actions on a certain mug or something.
Sure.
And so, yeah, it's been, labor is definitely the most expensive part of, you know, producing the products, or the cost of goods sold. And then obviously you have to incorporate the manufacturing overhead. And
how big's the team today?
Well, right now there's 4 people.
4 people. That's crazy. That's big to me. And, you know, we've had businesses with, I don't know, 100 employees. I think might be on the largest side so far. And I think having a full-time employee sounds like a terrifying next step. And so to have 4 is special. And so when you think, I guess, back to early days and spreadsheets where you're like, you know, the clay is $100 a box. I make 100 plates. Okay, so it needs to be more than $1 a plate. And I feel like that's an overly simplified model to build a successful business on. It sounds like you've taken out loans, right? You said Mountain Biz work with a loan. I don't know if you take an investment, because you did do a pitch competition where I saw you first. So is part of your growth, or I'll say like self-education in financial modeling and looking at cash flows and thinking about the business like a actual business versus a thing that you do, is that in part due to, you know, seeking outside investments at different stages?
Yeah, last year I pitched for 6 months to a number of different organizations and funds, different groups. And right before the pandemic, I had I was prepared to sell, you know, a part of the business for a fairly substantial amount of capital. And then the stock market crashed.
Wow.
And so everyone got cold feet. It was really close to providing, we were going to hire, you know, a full-time marketing and sales team, have fairly substantial marketing budget. And the big push was into lighting. I mean, that's something that I've always been really passionate about, but it's an avenue that isn't explored as much as I think it could be in ceramics. And we have this porcelain that we're able to really make glow, and it comes alive when a bulb is inside. And the lighting market is, it's really interesting because you have customers or consumers that appreciate design. They really get it. So you're not working on trying to find customers that balk at the idea of spending $40 on a mug. These customers are buying furniture, they're buying art, and they understand what the value is of creating these things. So it's a really exciting market to be moving into. But yeah, we were really close to kind of closing those investments. The discussions are still going on, but with the pandemic, there was so much uncertainty that, you know, kind of selling part of the business and, you know, acquiring the capital wasn't something that could happen during all the uncertainty. But with that, I wrote a 50-page business plan and had 3-year cash flow projections and very solid strategy of what we needed to do to move forward. And fortunately, it's all still happening, just a lot slower. But organic growth can also be exciting and fun. And so that's what this year has really been about, is kind of maintaining the course from that business plan, but also, you know, making sure that we have, you know, the right projects lined up to have good cash flow.
Sure. That, thank you for sharing that. And I want to ask a question with the realization that this last year has, a pandemic. So granted, that's I'll call it a wild hair that no one could have prepared for. But can you remember back to some of the first conversations, either with a mountain biz work, where they're like, hey, you say, I need a loan. And they say, sure, tell us about the business. Or, hey, I'm open to outside investors. And they say, sure, tell us about the business. And some of the first either, I think about a document, a business plan is surely something that everyone would have heard of or seen when they Google it. Are there anything that kind of stand out to you as like, oh, I didn't know that I would need to know that. I got to get smart on this new concept that I'd never thought of.
Well, the first thing they look at is the financials, right? So they'll typically, if they like the kind of summary page, then they'll automatically go straight to what your projections are and what the margins are on the products. And so I spent, 6 months developing financial forecasting, and now I've got weekly cash flow projections, which is amazing. I know exactly how much money I'm going to have at the beginning and end of every week, which seems, a little excessive, but it's also really, it saved a lot of stress over starting the business and building it for 5 years of not knowing what was going to be happening the next month. And now I'm able to really have a strong sense of what's going in and what's going out in order to, budget and figure out what decisions to make based on, grounded in financial realities. So I'd say the financials were definitely the biggest thing, because, it's easy. It's not easy. There's a lot of great ideas out there, but ultimately they're not going to be successful, sustainable, or scalable unless the financials make sense. And so having a firm grasp on that was something that took time, and that was, the biggest takeaway from building that business plan and putting the financials together was now I have a really sound understanding of what the business looks like and what it's doing, from a numbers perspective.
Yeah, and being able to look back and say, here's what happened, and look forward and say, so here's what I think. Even if an investor says, I don't think that what you just wrote is real, they might say, but I think you're off by like 30%. And even then, like, I think that's okay. Like, I know how you're thinking about the future. And it seems to me that that's the real exercise. They'll argue potentially on future forecasts and assumptions if it's a multiple of the past, right? Well, I don't know that you can possibly grow at 50%. Well, we have the capacity, but do you have the customers? And so there can be pushback. But having something to push back against is the key, it seems. And I have a friend who says that if they don't push back, they're not interested enough. Move on, right? Like, you want someone who's going to say, "Well, I think you have it at a 30% growth year over year. I think that sounds aggressive. You might really only experience 20%." That means they're interested. Like, that's a good argument to be having about like what the future looks like. And so I commend you on what I'll call I don't know, the becoming forecasty or financially literate as a business owner. That is not easy. I'm working through it. I know that I as a business major, I might have had a little bit of exposure to financial statements earlier, but it's one thing to take a accounting 101 course. It's another thing to actually reconcile bank statements and understand what's happening. Do you run out of QuickBooks?
Yeah. Okay. Yep. It's all on QuickBooks. And then I export it to Google Sheets. So I have my master projections and forecasting calculator on Google Sheets that comes from QuickBooks.
Interesting. There's I don't want to call it a dream. That might make it sound too real or important, but one of the futures of making it in Asheville to me is like is doing things like, hey, we're going to all talk about QuickBooks this month. Like, QuickBooks is the thing, because I've tried so hard to get good at QuickBooks over the last couple of years. And I've not heard of like exporting into Google Sheets and modifying from QuickBooks. And I want to do a whole nother conversation on what that looks like, because I'm a geek and I like to know, what numbers are going to look like in, the month ahead and the week ahead. So I love that cash flow on that granular of a level. The next part of the conversation, which we've mentioned that we talk about and haven't gotten to yet, is it's one thing to have a couple thousand followers on Instagram and use an email list to launch a Kickstarter. It's another thing to have a marketing budget and think about marketing as a business. And I'm wondering, how has your relationship with marketing evolved over the last 5 years?
Yeah. Well, we've worked with like 5 different marketing agencies. We've had 3 marketing managers that were there for fairly extended periods of time. We have built out and have a very good framework for what campaign launches look like. The website's, been polished and it's constantly updated. But I think in our industry, well, we've shifted a lot with the brand too. I mean, there was a period of time where we had resident artists, so we'd have other artists from the community or nationally recognized artists come into the studio and create bodies of work, and then we'd sell limited edition runs of those. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite a financially viable part of the business, but it was kind of something that was exciting as far as content went for our followers, and it created a lot of growth. My specialty is certainly not marketing, and I have a fairly private life, so I'm not somebody that's on Instagram. In fact, I just got Instagram on my phone after like 3 years the other day because we did a giveaway for the table lamp. And so I, was curious what the feedback was. But so we've had people running the Instagram account. For the past year, I've been managing emails, website updates. But really the focus has been selling lighting, and that's more of a B2B business. And that's something that I'm far better at, is working with potential buyers and customers, especially that are reselling. And so for the past year specifically, my focus has been on acquiring partnerships that are other businesses that will sell the lights. So it's been less of a focus on the direct consumer, on retail on the website, and more of a focus on larger products and projects. And the other thing is, a significant part of our business from time to time over the years has been custom production. We're one of the only ceramic studios in the country that can take a 3D model, work with the client or customer on dimensioning and prototyping it, 3D printing it, making a mold system, and creating a scalable method of production so we can, do large scale runs of their products. And with that capacity and opportunity, we've done a lot of custom production, and that's something that retailers like Uncommon Goods and even East Fork Pottery in town, we made vases for them for a year. And so that's definitely been, part of the B2B side of things that I really enjoy doing, that I'm comfortable with, and working with new clients, and kind of alleviate some of the pressure of focusing on direct to consumer sales on our website.
That's wonderful. I think that there's a lot of nuance in the difference of building a brand that speaks to a end user and building a brand that speaks to end users and also buyers or other brands and distributors, and words that sound like distributor or rhyme with it. And so I know that the economics change, right? So now you're selling at a wholesale price, which is sometimes paper thin margins depending on the industry. And I'm wondering what needed to change, as you said, we're going to think more about wholesale than direct to consumer. Obviously, it seems like packaging might change, but I don't know if that's true. And then pricing or product runs, what are some of the details that showed up that you might not have prepared for?
Yeah, well, with this spreadsheet where I'm able to calculate exact costs on everything, is it's an understanding of the scale and the process that goes into each product. So every time, a client comes to us with an idea, we say, well, hey, here are the kind of design specs that we need to think within in order to establish this project and make it efficient and financially mutually beneficial. Mm-hmm. For us too, especially shifting into lighting, it wasn't only kind of a passion and our opportunity to embrace porcelain, our material. And the porcelain, we mix everything from scratch too. So the porcelain we've developed is something that we're the only ones that can make the specific recipe. Not to say that there aren't other translucent porcelains out there. I mean, most porcelain's translucent when it's fired hot enough. But this one's really robust. We're able to make complex shapes. It does what we want it to, and we have full control over the materials. And so knowing that we can make it glow, we were thinking, well, because with pottery, inevitably margins are razor thin. It takes a lot of time. Everything's still handmade, even though we use molds. I mean, the amount of time that people are working on things is significant. And so we were trying to figure out what could bring us the most value as far as a product goes. And because the lighting industry is synonymous with the furniture industry, there's more of an appreciation for vessels that hold light rather than vessels that hold water.
Wow.
And it's something that I'm passionate about. I have a number of pendants and sconces up in my house, and it's really nice to consider light and the spaces that are lit and how that changes your mood and affects conversation and interactions with other people and your activities.
Sure. Yeah, I admittedly am the type who doesn't necessarily think about that, but what I do think about are where opportunities to find increased margin for about the same amount of work exist. And so I whether or not I have ever thought about a sconce before, or thought that a sconce is a pastry, which is not, it's a scone, and that's a bad joke perhaps, but but like I might have said, well, like if this amount of work makes us X, where would the same amount of work make us 1.7x or 2x? And if looking around I realized that, hey, lights are cool, and also it's about the same thing. It's just like a cup is this, and then a light is this, and you need a wire hole. Like, it's about the same thing. Let's do sconces. So I love that we can be different and move towards the same destination. That's fascinating. And so then, selling B2B, bunch of emails. Are you going to different types of trade shows, or are you just like cold emailing buyers or directors or whatever the right term might be in that industry?
Yeah, well, we were supposed to go to a couple trade shows this year that got postponed. The one that was most exciting to get into is Architectural Digest in New York. And I think they're now planning a 2021 show. So hopefully that happens. But that's definitely a great way to meet people in the industry. But fortunately, we built up the brand enough to have, brand recognition when approaching other retailers and partners in the lighting industry, with interior designers and architects as well. And the most exciting one that just happened is a company called Y Lighting. And so they're a subsidiary of Y Design Group, which owns Lumens and Y Lighting. But I think reading that business model, I think the first kind of partner on the list to acquire for the sales strategy was Y Lighting. And we recently signed a contract to be the first exclusive ceramic lighting brand with them. We're launching in January. So really excited about that.
It's amazing.
It's nice to have an opportunity to be recognized for lighting, kind of beyond vases, mugs, oil bottles, and some of our staple tabletop goods.
And so if you're not in the space, what would be an example of a Y Lighting and maybe a different industry? Like, are they kind of like the primary channel in the space? What would that mean to someone who's not an interior designer, perhaps?
Sure. So their main competitors would be Whiteology, Design Within Reach,
Okay.
Wayfair, and so really more like home decor, high-end home decor retailers. But why lighting is great because they carry some of the kind of most notable lighting brands, Roland Hill, Hubbardson Forge, and then some great glass pendant companies, which we like to stay in touch with because we're kind of making similar products,
Mm.
same ilk. But yeah, it's more kind of the home decor shopping online retailers.
So that is very helpful for me to place it. I imagine a listener as well. And so, love to take a second to try and think through perhaps the pros and cons list that you thought through while making a business plan and said, like, let's find a partner channel sale distributor type fit. I imagine one with a giant brand. Clearly, there's value there. Was there ever a fear that, like, if you go with just one, then you could make the wrong choice? Like, I'm just wondering what thoughts were you thinking, because that is, I'm incredibly excited for 2021 for you. I just also have never had to make a choice like that. I'm wondering what you thought.
Yeah, well, it's still winding down. I mean, we'd onboarded with a couple of their competitors that we've had to pull out from. But we ended up ultimately going with Y Design. When we're looking for new partners, it really is like multifaceted opportunities. And so we'll not only be selling our collection on their website, and because we'll be exclusive, we'll have homepage placement and placement in the catalogs, and they'll be placing a purchase order of inventory to kind of, solidify and initiate the partnership.
Great.
But they are also interested in producing other lighting and working with their design team to kind of facilitate collaborations with some of the other businesses. So like Hubbardson Forge is a steel lighting company that's incredibly well known. They've been around for a decade or two, I guess, and they really focus on the armatures and the hardware. And so we have an opportunity to work with them and diffuse the bulb. So that's really what our studio is built for as far as lighting goes, is creating fixtures or sculptural vessels that go around the light bulbs to diffuse them and help kind of create or cast certain light off of armatures. So we're looking forward to kind of all the kind of facets of the partnership and the opportunities that it'll provide with Y Lighting. But it was really hard to say no to the other opportunities. I think it's really easy to get buried on some of these websites online. And so having a partnership where you're exclusive and they're invested in you seemed to make the most sense. And it's funny, I think I got in contact with them through LinkedIn. I found the merchandising manager at Y Lighting and I messaged her 10 times. And eventually she looked at the catalog and emailed me right back and said, "Hey, we want to take you on as an exclusive brand." I said, "Okay."
Wow. People, pause real quick. 10 emails or 10 in messages or 10 whatever. I mean, that is, it's not unique, but it's a truism, right? Like, wow, what if you had stopped at 5?
Right.
Like, what if you had stopped at 5?
Oh, I mean,
you would have been well within your reason to have stopped reaching out, and I'm so glad that you didn't. And like, that's amazing. Okay. And so, is there a term on this? Your father's a contract lawyer, so I imagine everything's gonna like is as good as it can be. But what is a relationship like that? Is it indefinite? Is there like a year window, a 2-year window where you're exclusively sold through them?
We agreed to do it for a year.
Cool. So
we're going to try it for a year and see how it goes.
That's really exciting. I can't wait to hear how it goes. But so many parts of that tale give me the warm fuzzies and I hope inspire people. And so typically at this point I'll ask, like, what are you looking forward to in 2021 in your business? What are you thinking about? I'm going to go ahead and guess that this partnership might be one of the primary things you're thinking about in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, any opportunity to, really keep pushing the light. We have 9 pendants so far. But one thing, I stepped back last year and created a modular mold library, which essentially means there's all these plaster mold parts that are like Legos. And so you can build a custom mold that creates all these different shapes. So there's a whole shelf full of hundreds of these mold parts and infinite possibilities just waiting to be played with. And, unfortunately, a lot of the time is elusive in the studio. And so it's exciting to have some opportunities to be able to revisit the mold library frequently and design some new things. We recently launched a new collection of vases with the modular mold library and a new collection of planters. As you can see, I'm turning into a plant fanatic for COVID. So,
shout out to the YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed on YouTube, this might be the time to do it. You have the most beautiful looking, I'll call it a greenhouse, but I know that it's not. It's beautiful.
My kitchen.
It's your kitchen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tons of living things. And are any of those made by Bright Angle? I'm seeing a couple with some harder angles. I imagine those are you.
Yeah. So these are part of the new collection. And the reason why we designed them is we did a show called the Philadelphia Museum Show, which was online. And then also I just kept acquiring plants and I needed pots to put them in. I still, there's some terracotta pots which work really well, but I really wanted to see what I could do with this mold system. And so I got to make some pots. It was really fun.
And for those of you listening on the podcast, I would say from my angle, they might be octagonal or some sort of number of sides in total. They follow what would be a relatively familiar shape with like a wider base than a narrower neck and a slightly jutted out head. If I'm going to make a body out of the vessel, except there are hard angles, which you've already taught us is not really something you can do when you're turning clay is the right term? Is it spinning clay?
Yeah,
clay?
Throwing
clay. Dang, come on. So it very hard to do, and is I'll call it a trademark at this point of your brand. Does that sound fair?
Yeah. We named it the Bright Angle for a reason, and I think part of the idea is to help illuminate spaces. And we happen to have a lot of angles in the work to do it. So
I love it. Perfect. So, thinking about wrapping up and putting a bow on this business part of the conversation. Anything that we kind of talked about that maybe you wanted to just wrap up as business conversation? The answer can be no. Cool. Perfect. Yeah, and so then we'll transition into what I'll call a little bit of a conversation on making it in Asheville, and we have a Asheville conversation. So now, you mentioned that your car broke down, and that's sort of how you found Asheville, or was there any rhyme or reason? I know you said Penland School, and maybe you were assistant for a moment.
Yeah. So essentially the ultimate goal was to get to Penland to assist my friend Matt Kelleher. But it's not in Asheville, right?
Right.
So
no.
I visited my friend who'd been living here for about a year, and we went to the old wedge, or the only wedge that was there in 2012, and
Sure.
My car wouldn't start. And yeah, I don't know. There's something about being at that place that just felt really right, and I love the mountains. Every time you come north, south, east, west into Asheville, you're going over and into this beautiful valley. But the most special thing about being at the Wedge in the initial days I was here was the community and connections that existed back then. You'd sit down and you'd be next to a woodworker, like Tom Gibson would be around, or Tina Council had her metal studio down there in Payne's old studio, or Hayden Wilson, Kate Adams, and the Glass Blowers. And so it was just amazing. You'd be sitting there with all these different artists, and all of a sudden collaborations would happen, food would happen, and we were all kind of going through this Asheville craft life together, learning from each other, growing with each other, and drinking a lot of Iron Rail and Payne's Pale, and so that, that really, for the first few years that existed back then, before a lot of these artists kind of moved studios, or the scene changed down there. It was a really amazing community to feel a part of.
Wow. So you sort of took my next question and you might have answered it, but I like to do word association. Asheville and the word community, what shows up for you? It sounds like it might be the wedge and what you just talked us through.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely like the local watering hole. At the end of the day, at 5 or so, everyone would come down from all the different studio buildings, and we'd share pictures and talk about craft art or whatever else was going on. It was really amazing to have people going through the same things, and they're all problem solvers, that were incredibly skilled. This area has some of the most incredibly skilled craftspeople in the world. They understand materials and how to work with them, make them, and that, it has to do with the history and materials that are available. And then Penland School of Craft is nearby, and a number of other craft schools within a 2-hour radius. But a lot of these craftspeople have settled in Asheville and in the surrounding areas. So,
wow. For what it's worth, Sarah and I think also had a moment at the Wedge on our first visit where we had walked from downtown, from, kind of proper Asheville, because we're used to walking 30 minutes we lived in Brooklyn. We'd walk 30 minutes on just, almost every day to get to either a subway stop that was more convenient or to get into, call it Williamsburg. And so we're like, I don't know, people talk about river arts as a concept, put it on the map. I'm like, I don't know, it's 24 minutes. How crazy could it be? And it was kind of crazy. Like there's a real kind of hill the whole way down. And the hill going back up was less fun, but the walk down there and having a beer at the original Wedge, I guess, and we were around that time of day. People were, pre-COVID, sitting with strangers at our little bench. It was beautiful, and so I get how that can be the thing you think. With that, I mean, when looking ahead to 2021 as a person, or I guess this will come out in 2021. And so we have a magic wand question that we like to ask. And so the answer can have to do with business. It could have to do with whatever you want. But right now, if I had a magic wand or someone in our audience had a magic wand, what request might you make?
Ooh, that's a hard one. Well, I'm working on getting a puppy. If anybody out there,
cute.
I've applied for to adopt puppies for the past couple months. Built a fence. I'm good to go. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty simple kind of request, but something to get through COVID stuff is having an activity to do. But yeah, I think that's it'd be nice to have. I've lived with dogs for many years, and I think a puppy would be a really fun companion bring to the studio. And I love walking around this town, so yeah. I guess that's my magic wand.
That's a really good request. Possibly had a lot of requests at this point. That might be my favorite. I don't know if it's because Sarah and I are experiencing a little bit of puppy fever in our own world. Like I keep sending her dog Instagram meme things. And so, awesome request. The last question of this podcast is, if someone was listening, loved your story, wants to support, participate, follow along, where would they find you on the World Wide Web or the internet at large?
Yeah, so our website is thebrightangle.com. And then we have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the handle for that is The Bright Angle. Those are kind of the primary. You sign up for our email list. We do frequently launch new products and have exclusive sales. And so we don't bombard people, but we definitely remind them that we're out there making beautiful things. So
I love it. Well, thank you for the time. We'll have links to all of that in the show notes and on our podcast page, and everywhere that we can, we'll link to you and to your products on this. So thank you, Nick, for the time today. And I really, really look forward to 2021 for you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.